Coming up on the Fulcrum Global Podcast, we discuss artificial intelligence in the national security, defense, and private sectors. We also talk about the pros, the cons, and what's not being discussed. So what are both the benefits and the dark side of AI? Let's find out now. Stand by for Fulcrum Global. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast, where friends and peers get together to discuss and brainstorm on issues and trends impacting the world of national security, defense, intelligence, and foreign affairs. I'm Sam Kessler, the host, chief editor of Fulcrum Global, which is part of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at American Military University. And today we have some interesting guests here. The topic for today is going to be on artificial intelligence, looking at the strategy, the uses, the pros, the cons, the way it can be used, and how to help people better understanding the issues surrounding it, both from a national security perspective, but maybe public or private. It's a big issue that a lot of people are talking about, and I think they're going to be talking about it for a long time. So let's get started. Our two guests are Carl C.J. Unis, who is a returning guest on our podcast, and we have Michael Maestas, who is currently the co-founder of a U.S.-based AI enterprise software company. He has an MBA in management of technology, which focuses on entrepreneurship and high growth companies. And he is also a computer engineer degree. He focuses on solving root cause analysis for solving complex systems and data and operations. With over 2 decades of professional experience with national laboratories, Department of Energy and Defense, government, education, enterprise, and private business, he has a broad expertise in technology, engineering, business operations, and complex systems. Mr. Maestas is regularly sought out for his insight, knowledge, and expertise in data, cyber, and technology. And Carl C.J. Unis is currently a systems engineer with the U.S. Space Force. He has a master's degree in systems engineering from the Stevens Institute of Technology, which focuses on systems engineering practices, methodology, subcomponent architecture, and systems design. His main area of focus is on systems complexity and cascading failures of enterprise systems. He has over 20 years of professional experience in various disciplines. He is subject matter expert in CO and COOP, which is continuity of operations, COOG, continuity of government, devolution, infrastructure, community resiliency, hybrid energy systems, and supply chain logistics. Mr. Unis spent over 10 years at Sandia National Laboratories as a systems engineer, performing complex systems analysis for the Department of Energy, Homeland Security, Defense, and other government agencies. He is an internationally recognized expert in his field and is regularly sought out for his insight, knowledge, and expertise. Gentlemen, thank you for being on the Fulcrum Global Podcast. You both have very impressive backgrounds, and you have a lot to offer to the conversation on AI and how it applies to everything from national security to the public sector. And these are issues that people are talking about. And like I said earlier, they'll continue discussing it. So from, an AI perspective, what are some of the things that you feel that have to be addressed going forward in order to deal with it? What are people talking about versus what they're not talking about? And what are concerns and ways it can be used properly?
Well, I think to set the context of this whole conversation is that a lot of people, when they think of AI, they think of Terminator, they think of, sentience and the robots. And, you really have to understand that AI is not inherently good or bad, just like most other tools and things and technologies in the world. It's going to do what it's instructed and what it's told to do, and it's going to do what it's used for. And, in that context, AI is often talked about as this magic thing that's going on, sentience, replacing humans, the rise of the robots. And we really have to look at it from a more pragmatic standpoint of view. AI doesn't really change a lot of the fundamentals that we face. Security, information, actionable intelligence, discernment, how we solve problems, all these things that we do normally, AI just is a force multiplier and an accelerant on that. But it does have some substantial impacts. There are things that it's good at, and there are things that it's not as good at as people think. And we have to keep in mind some perspectives on the information that it does provide when we do get quote unquote answers from it. CJ, I want to hear your perspective as well too
Yeah,
on that.
I want to dovetail on that comment too. So it's interesting that humans have developed a machine that has the capability to learn than the people that faster than the people that created it. So I think we're at a really interesting paradigm in our history right now where if we don't if we're not stewards of this technology, it has the ability to get us to a place that may not be very good. So it's very important in some of the conversations that we're having around data latency, around analysis, around systems, around the way in which we think about these problems and how they propagate, and making sure there used to be this thing called a library and a card catalog, and those things are kind of obsolete now with the internet and with AI, and being able to. The concerns that I have are, where is that data coming from? Where are the data sets that are being utilized to talk about these things? Can it be referenced? Those are some concerns that I have from that operational side of things. That if then construct. If we're going to use this, then we have to understand that there could potentially be implications downstream, and we need to be cognizant of those things across the board. Because if we're not, then we're setting ourselves up for short and long-term failure.
Well, it sounds like it's something that has to be very heavily stress test and checked. And I mean, how does that work in the fast-paced environment that we're in? And as it continues to develop and evolve without having all that stress testing, I mean, does that take years, or just you just put a great deal of emphasis in one setting? And I mean, do you use machine learning to apply that type of stress test, or is it a combination of everything?
Well, I think it's important to have a context and perspective of what AI and what machine learning, really is, and what it's really, capable of. There's a term that they use, constructive. AI is very good at constructive types of things. That's why we see with Chat GPT where it's writing poems, it's writing essays, it'll write snippets of code, it will, make artwork, it'll do all these things. Because when it comes to anything that is formulaic, that can be constructed, that can be extrapolated, that can be built, AI is very, very good at it. And those are the areas that it's going to impact heavily with it. But with that, we also have to realize that AI and machine learning are not quite as magical as people like to take a look at it. It's basically a very simple, and I'm simplifying it, but it's like a brute force analysis, and it flows through and then comes back and learns, and it really uses more probabilistic methods. It learns relationships, it learns proximity, it learns from the volume of information that's out there, and it uses that to utilize its algorithms to then construct answers and responses to it. And so um, it's not quite as expansive of a thing as people believe it is. It's like, oh yeah, it's doing some magic, huge algorithms that are coming up with these amazing things. But that's where it starts to have some of the challenges with AI when we utilize it, is because of the way that it fundamentally works and the way that it fundamentally happens. Now, it's going to advance over time. Obviously, things are going to grow, things are going to get better, there are going to be breakthroughs in certain things. But it's important to understand that we think that in AI, we're getting the answer. And the truth is we're getting an answer.
Mm.
And that really segues into a lot of the things that we really need to consider with AI, because you may ask it the same question several times and get different answers.
Right. And I think to your point, being able to recognize the data sets that some of these answers are coming from are really important. But it's also important to recognize that AI and machine learning and big data are still in a learning phase in a lot of these domain spaces. When you're talking about some of the chat GPTs that are out there, um, it's modeled after a neural network. And we as humans learn a certain way. Well, the AI mimics that way that we learn from the human side of things. So 20% of it is probably useful right now, and the other 80% isn't so useful. So it's a consideration that needs to be made right now. If you think that Chat GPT or some piece of AI has got all of the answers, it really doesn't. But it's learning. It's learning at an exponential rate every day, and those data sets and those servers and the machine continues to learn and learn and learn until it comes to some optimal algorithm where it will be able to answer the thing that you are asking it quite rapidly. Right now, it's learning and thinking through those processes and procedures. So it's important to consider those things right now.
Well, and that really comes where the models are trained and how they get their outcome. To give you some examples, there's an article, I believe the title of it, or it's close to this, is the dark side of Chat GPT, and it talks about the low paid hordes of people who are basically going through and building these data sets, because you have an image, somebody's got to go through and say, this is a blue car, it's a Kia, it's a, et cetera, et cetera. And they have to format, because really the analysis algorithms are what a lot of people look to. But really, the data needs to be structured in such a way. And we have to look at, what is that data? ChatGPT 3 had a much, much smaller set of training data. ChatGPT 4 has a significantly larger one. That's what they say, oh, look, the algorithm, changed probably some, but it was really the data set that made the big difference in that. And you say, okay, well, if you have human beings classifying it, if you have human beings structuring it, if you have data sets that contain, as we know, all kinds of variances of information, what's good information? What's bad information? What is it being trained on? What are the biases in those? Because the biases in the data filter out to biases in results. And that one of the big note challenges of AI. When you talk, it's one thing if you're playing with it as an individual, you're having it write some things. A lot of people are playing with ChatGPT, but if you're really trying to operate with it in an enterprise level, for business, for government, for security, for military, the problem is that black box. Even the creators of these algorithms, even the creators of these systems, oftentimes they'll tell you they don't know, even though they wrote the algorithms, how it's actually getting the answer, because it's just too complex and it's too variable because it's probabilistic. So, when you talk about relying on the data and relying on the answers from an actionable intelligence, as I mentioned before, consistency and accuracy, you can ask it the same question, completely the same, get different answers, variations of it, and you don't know exactly what you're going to get. It could be great. It could have fatal flaws in it. And the worst part is you don't know because you don't know where it came from or how it got it.
Well, and to your point, when these developers are developing this software, developing these algorithms, there's there's potentially an unconscious bias to the way in which these algorithms are being written. And these folks who are writing the code have a certain way of looking at the problem. When you've got folks in government or you've got folks in the private sector or industry who are depending on this AI to give them an answer or some that leads to a decision, uh, it's important to consider that there could be some bias that's already built into this equation. And from a government perspective, and full disclosure here, my opinions did not reflect anything of the U.S. government or the Space Force, but it's important that we consider the way in which that these decisions need to be made in the future with regard to all of this data. And this, we have so much data coming at us, it sometimes can lead to analysis paralysis. So the actual lack of making a decision could potentially lead to bigger problems. But it's also important to consider the way in which that data is being presented to us and the data latency, the validation, the verification and the validation of that data. So being able to look at it through a systems lens is critically important on a number of different fronts and scales.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like, it's a double-edged sword. Chat GPT and many of these other systems, obviously we use it because it's a one of main example. They're fixed data sets. They're not connected to the internet. And that's intentional because obviously there are challenges and security risks if that's the case. Well, as CJ mentioned, then you have data latency. If you're trying to make real time or actionable intelligence decisions, you need stuff that's current and up to date. How often does that happen? And there's a lot of things with that. And here's another thing. Believe it or not, there's actually ethical and economic choice kind of implications on it, because what happens is it's been brought up. Okay, let's use this example. AI generates a picture, not a national security impact, but it has an economic impact. Well, if it's running from the data sets, it may be copying or pulling from other artists or artwork. So is it copyright infringement? And then if AI generates it, can it be copyrighted? Who's really the owner? Who's really the creator? It's things you don't really think about, superficially, but they have big implications. I mean, with these kinds of things.
Yeah, and just imagine the level of impact that it has on industries. Like when you're talking about like music or pictures, I immediately started thinking about how back in the early 2000s you had like companies like Napster, and I can't think of who else were making it possible to download music. And I know this from experience. So I was in college at the time, and everyone in college was downloading stuff from Napster, and I think Kazaa was another one that came after that, and there are a few others. But I know one thing, when I hear people talk about how the music industry was never the same after that, I mean, it kind of ties into what you're bringing up, in terms of like ethics, but also changing industries. Um, but when you're talking about with bias and, basically dealing with the amount of information that comes in and the biases and also the people creating this program and it has maybe a slant. Um, I also equate that to people who are analysts, in an open source intelligence environment, and you have to look through a lot of different information. One thing I always tell people is be better at digesting the information you receive so that you can not just take things at face value, but to look for maybe hidden nuggets versus stuff that people are not going to pay attention to, but might apply to another type of intelligence product, or just, some kind of analysis. And I mean, people are still figuring, I mean, not everyone has that kind of discipline, but when you put something like AI into the loop, it's kind of, it's going to raise some of those similar questions, but at a much different scale, I would imagine.
Well, and we've been talking a lot about, like I said, what AI is good at, the constructive, development, and analysis kinds of things. But there's a lot of areas that are going to be utilized for AI. We talk about like self-driving cars, and that can be extrapolated to so many other things, from targeting systems, decision making, intelligence. So many different areas are the same type of problem. And I've heard it said this way. I didn't, I heard this one, but an instructor is teaching a new student driver, and he says, well, you're coming down the road, and all of a sudden there's an old man in front of you on one side and a young woman carrying her child on the other side. What do you hit? And the student thinks about it and says, well, I I would say you'd hit the old man because he's lived his life. Obviously, a young woman, her baby and child. He's all, no, the brakes. You hit the brakes. But there are cases where there are those kind of no-win scenarios, or the things where it really comes down to a decision point. We face this a lot in national security. When do you order a strike? What do you take for strategic positioning? What do you do for engagement? What do you do in many different areas? And they aren't the same type of constructive decisions like generating text or artwork or solutions or problems. And so, do you let AI make those decisions? Because now you're putting real world consequences in the hands of the machine. And the reason I bring that up is it kind of leads a little bit to like liability. Elon Musk has famously said, well, self-driving cars only need to be better than a human, which is not very hard. Then they already are much better. But if CJ goes and drives his car and goes and hits someone, CJ ends up being liable. If the self-driving car and the AI hits someone, where does the liability lie? And that liability factor, I think, is going to be one of the big short-term challenges with AI and its usage in real-world areas. Is, not necessarily is it going to give the good or right answer, but at some point, law of averages, it's going to have a wrong decision or a decision that leads to some type of consequences. And now legally, where does that liability lie? It's still kind of unclear right now where that's going to be. But that kind of leads to this point. A lot of people are talking AI as a replacement for humans. They're talking about, oh, it's going to, wipe out the workforce, 40%. All these people are going to be out of work. All these things are going to happen. There's going to be some shifts and there's going to be some things that are going to happen. But I think what we're going to see as the more practical reality of it is AI is really going to become a force multiplier. It's really going to become where it's going to enable the humans to become much faster and much better and have much better information at their fingertips. Example of the constructive analysis, analyzing x-rays for cancer. It's already known that AI can do it far, far earlier detection and far, far better than any surgeon or doctor analyzing those. Is that going to eliminate doctors? No. What it's going to be is it's going to provide the force multiplier for the doctors to provide them better tools, just like a lot of other things have, to provide that actionable intelligence. So I think what we're going to see is productivity rise and the force multiplier happening, not necessarily a shift in elimination.
I think it's also important to highlight, Sam, that there's what Michael's talking about here. This analytical force multiplier becomes very apparent in industries that don't have enough people to put behinds in seats. So it's really important that we're dealing. Our industry is dealing with a lack of STEM or tech talent across the board because there aren't enough people that have this type of background or understanding, and being able to utilize AI and machine learning and big data as an analytical force multiplier is absolutely critical to be able to not only achieve the mission, but also execute on the mission as well.
It seems that to go back with what Michael was saying, that with those industries, it requires a little retraining in terms of how to use it in order to still apply their craft at the same time. When you tie that in with you were saying, CJ, with getting more people to from STEM and other fields to apply this, how do you go forward with this? I know there have been some people talking about using AI in order to make up for the slack in terms of the amount of people to work on it, like you mentioned. But for everyday people, in terms of how they apply it to whatever fields that are in, whether it's the intelligence, national security, or medicine, or it could be other fields too. Do they have the right, how do you develop a mindset for applying it in terms of understanding it? And that's something I know you mentioned before this we talked, but how do you get people starting to think about how to apply it? Because from my perspective, we've had talks about this as a supplement, and my example is always going to be Star Trek with AI, and I know it's but
Sure.
but I always go back to a Next Generation episode where Geordi LaForge is using the ship's computer holodeck to solve a problem, and he's still on top of his field. I think that's like the perfect use of AI in that sense, because he knows his skill, his fundamental, and applying it. But also those people, they're in the future, and theoretically they grew up with this technology as part of their lives. But in the last 15 years or so, people have been getting more accustomed to using smart technology, their phones, the computers, in ways that were never used before that. But I think people are still learning how to apply it better. I think it seems like it's something it would take decades or generations to really master it in many ways, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think what you're really segueing into is, how do we continue the development and the application of AI? And this is where we've been talking about a lot of real world impacts of it and how it really applies. but there's kind of a little bit of a dark side of AI, and I want to address it because, again, when you say dark side of AI, people are thinking Terminators. They're thinking the rise of the machines and those kinds of things happening. But really, there's some more fundamental things. These aren't new issues. What AI is it's another tool that exacerbates some of these issues. And so, um, one of them is reliance on AI. We already have an issue with reliance on technology. What happens, from a strategic standpoint and a commercial standpoint, if the GPS system is taken down? We have power grid. We have, a lot of national security and a lot of infrastructure things. We've seen what happens when even systems and businesses or banks, have had intermittent, attacks and issues. And we realize that we've become so reliant on them that if they're not functioning, it kind of grinds us to a halt and to our knees. And I think AI has the ability to exacerbate that, as far as leaning more dependence on things that are potentially at risk. Um, the other thing with AI is there are some real um, issues with it as far as nefarious use, as far as things that could be real challenges and problems. Um, One of them is like the discontinuity, I would call it, between our existing software and infrastructure, our monolithic 100 million billion line of code software programs, our systems that we have, and they're they're not updated for long periods of time. Some of these are very old. They do the best they can, partially because updating them or transitioning to a new system is just so incredibly taxing. It's a huge lift in cost and time and even ability to do it. And then it has so many vectors of attack, because they use so many different protocols. It's so large. They have so many silos. They have so many libraries. Who knows what's in them? We won't go into all those implications. But what's happening now is we already have this zero-day attack problem. We already have vulnerabilities that are exploited and things that happen. But we've always had the benefit of the time and scale protection. Someone has to sit there and figure it out and identify that vulnerability and capitalize on it. And now we have AI again that's really good at analysis and scraping. And so now we have a discontinuity and a disconnect between systems availability to defend and identify and protect against attacks and exploits, and AI's ability to generate those exploits. It would be analogous to, you're fighting with a bow and arrow and a knife, and an A10 warthog comes along. Not really going to be much of a fight, and catching up is going to be very challenging and very difficult. So we have that area. We have issues with, there's an article, that, again, I'm getting the title mostly right probably, but it's called 40,000 Ways to Die. And there was a drug development company that you want to find the good effects and you want the AI to weed out toxic and poisonous effects because that would be bad in a drug. Well, they went to a conference and somebody said, it's really challenging because, what happens instead of weeding out those toxic effects if you actually look for them? So they changed one line of code and they literally found 40,000 toxic chemicals that can kill human beings, including, I think, like 70 variants of VX gas, most of which were undiscovered and would be untraceable because nobody knew they existed. And again, AI is agnostic. It doesn't know good or bad. All it knows is you told it to weed out toxic effects or show the toxic effects. And that brings us to the big challenge with it is proliferation of AI. when we talk proliferation in so many other arenas, you really have logistics problems. You have materials, you have expertise, you have technology, you have, all kinds of barriers to getting around that. Well, AI, the cat's out of the bag. Um, you can train it on data sets, you can do things with it. A lot of it's open source. Even ones that aren't will eventually get leaked. And once it's out of the bag and it's digital, and being able to scrape for these kinds of things, you don't even need to have experts. You don't need to have some nuclear scientist, to, one of a kind, very rare, resource out there to do this. Joe Schmo with very little experience or expertise can plug it in, and utilize it. So it's going to be a very big challenge to protect against that with the proliferation of AI.
It's also important to highlight, Sam, in some of our previous discussions, the underlying infrastructure that supports all of these activities, from an operations, infrastructure, systems, human capital, cyber perspective, and the sixth one that I've recently added is integration architecture. And it's really important to consider all of these things and how they complement each other, because everything's connected. And I think it's also critically important to look at the way in which a lot of these things propagate throughout the system. So looking at how AI could be that analytical force multiplier, but it's also being a really critical thing to consider the human in the loop, and how critical of a role that they are playing in the way in which this information is being disseminated on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and as Michael mentioned earlier, when Musk brought up saying we should take time off from developing AI, people are still catching up. It doesn't mean your competitors or adversaries are taking a break. In fact, if that ever did happen, they would probably step up their efforts even more, I would imagine. If that was
Oh yeah, we're definitely not siloed or an island in this type of development, and I truly believe that there are also some large scale social and security implications, including national security, because national security relies on people. When you look at most of the security compromises in a lot of systems that happen, it's not like World War II where they cracked the Enigma and they cracked the cipher codes and everything. Great for movies, but that's not how most of them happen. Most of them happen through social engineering. People share passwords, they get them keylogged, they use the same password for everything. And we really have a lot of challenges and issues with that. I'll use an example, and I know this is crude, but it is realistic, especially when you look at what's happening with AI. You see the generative videos and pictures and everything. What happens if I go to someone who has national security access, really compromising things, and I say, hey, I need you to do this for me or provide me this information, or I'm going to send your wife this video of you having an affair. It's not real. It's AI generated, but I mean, we're humans, and a lot of times, even if you can prove or know that that's fake, it still may have social implications. And like I said, it sounds like a really crude example, but it's real things that we're going to face. And then we look at what's happening in China with surveillance and with everything else, where they can tell by your gant, your walk, even if your face is covered and they can't, do facial recognition, they can tell and fingerprint you. And they have social credit scoring going on. There's one where they took Wi-Fi routers, they trained the AI with the camera and the Wi-Fi, removed the cameras, and the AI learned, much like sonar echoes, how to be able to construct not just where the humans were, but even what pose or what position they were in, based off the wireless signals that were coming off the router. Basically, it made the router a surveillance device. There's a lot of things like this that I don't believe we're prepared for, and that we're thinking of, again, some big thing happening when really it's the proliferation. It's the problem of a lot of these things happening on a mass scale, and the potential of them that really can cause a huge problem.
It's not the technology that you may be concerned about or the new piece of technology that's coming out, Sam. It's the secondary and tertiary effects that are created from that technology. Kind of like when the internet first came out. It was all made for well-intended individuals. Well, we've seen what the internet has turned into, this 800-pound silverback gorilla, and there needs to be some real conversations around the governance of AI across the board. And we've had some conversations to that extent already. But again, it's understanding how this technology has the ability to proliferate at an exponential pace. And it's also very critical to look at the way in which the data, the people ingesting the data, are interpreting that data and then sending it back out. So it's like this giant feedback loop that occurs over and over again. So considerations need to be made there. So there's a lot of aspects of AI and machine learning and big data that a lot of people aren't thinking about because they assume that people are well intended. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and there needs to be some conversation around that as well.
Mhm. And as I mentioned before, AI does provide some new capabilities, but what AI really does is AI allows the time and scale protections that we've kind of relied on, like, you know, well, out of the one out of, I don't know what the number is, 1 out of 10,000 homes that get robbed, the chances of my home getting broken into are relatively small. Well, now AI makes it so there are 100,000 robbers that go out there to hit the 10,000 houses. Chances of getting hit, become so the speed and the scale of these problems exacerbating, I think, is one of the things that we're not ready for. I think people have enjoyed a percentage and a probability of potential things happening, and hopefully you're just not one of the unlucky ones, and that's really not going to be the case now as things start to grow and happen rapidly. And it's been brought up. This is a very challenging question. The development. How do you have governance around developing AI? How do you have an ethics standard around developing AI? Can you get everybody on board? I mean, we know we can't get everybody on board on pretty much anything. And so, I do believe that is something we need to strive for, but, we're not going to get certain countries. We're not going to get cartels and criminal organizations and people or even individuals to comply or follow along with a lot of these things. So it's going to be a real challenge moving forward, because again, I don't think we're prepared for how rapid it's going to happen and the proliferation of this technology, along with the speed and scale that it's going to happen in. That's what is different about this than this being the same problem, which it is, as we faced. It's just the speed and scale is going to be on a level that we're not used to and that we haven't seen before.
And I think to Michael's point, if you tie in AI with high performance computing or supercomputing, you've created one hell of a monster. So it's also very important to consider that potential path as well, because the more opportunities we have to ingest high performance computing in with AI, I believe IBM came up with their machine. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was, you remember the name?
I don't remember the name off the top of my head.
I don't know if you remember it or not, Sam, but Watson, that was it. So they created Watson, and this was Jeopardy a few years back, right? Where they were having the robot talk back and forth, and that was a learning tool for IBM. So that was a few years back, but I can only imagine what Watson has learned and the amount of computing power that Watson now has, based on what was learned on Jeopardy, to name a few things. So it's constantly learning, it's constantly evolving, and humans have to sleep. Computers don't, so they're constantly ingesting that data and getting more data and more input to learn more on a daily basis.
Well, and I want to bring up something. CJ and I have talked about this at length, and it doesn't necessarily. It's not just specific to AI. It's been with technology and innovation and development. But we've talked about how we keep our edge, which is a big national security interest in developing and being at the forefront and really being on top of the things that are happening. And really what's happened is we have kind of a 20th century, I almost want to say a 19th century policies and organizational structures that are dictating 21st century innovations. And this is a real challenge that we face. I mean, I know, and I've seen this throughout my career. I'll use an example, of someone I know, my business partner, phenom, incredible talent, incredibly good at so many of these things. One of the best people I've ever seen or met. And yet he doesn't have his degree. He's self-taught. And he's, relatively young without the degree. And if he were to enter the organizational structures, whether it's big business or whether it's our labs or any other thing, he would be treated, I hate to say this, like the janitor. He would be treated as a second or third class, person. And yet, that's what's happening. We have a real, I would venture to say it's more human, not politics in the political sense, but the office dynamics that go on where seniority, I've been here, I deserve, you've got to, do your stuff. Do you have the credentials and degrees? And we have a lot of the stuff that we're structured for these long-term retirement. We're structured for the organizational hierarchy and priorities that we have. Again, this 20th century organizational structure and viewpoint towards it. And what we're doing is we're completely decimating our ability to get in the talent and the people and the real brain power that we need to stay at the cutting edge and really stay competitive in these arenas.
Yeah. So to Michael's point, there was a conference that I just attended recently, and we got briefed at the unclassified level that we were being outpaced by China 4 or 5 to 1. Well, why is that? They're asking. Well, they've included their academics, their private sector, their industry, to name a few, and their civilian corps as well as their military. So they now have this force multiplier across the board where they're able to tap from all of these resources. And I think one of the biggest things that we're lacking in right now is the emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is a generational problem. We haven't put an emphasis on that, and we need to do more of that moving forward, because quite frankly, if we don't, we're setting ourselves up for even longer term failure than the deficit that we're currently at. So I believe an emphasis needs to be put on that moving forward within the universities. And some of the stuff that I'm doing around systems, I would be considered, and Mike and I were talking about this the other day, I would be considered a generalist in what I'm doing. So I think it's important to consider that we've become so specialized in all of these disciplines. We have to look through a systems lens to understand the complexities of these challenges that we're trying to address on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and what you guys have mentioned, I would say at some point in the 20th century, a lot of people came in and they didn't have the degrees, or they had the, I guess, general backgrounds that they ended up developing even more. But of course, those were different time periods where people could come in and they were given a chance and all that. Is that a bureaucracy issue, or is that a cultural issue? I mean, because it seems that, maybe, like I hate to go back to Cold War or World War II, but those were periods where we did utilize a lot of people from different industries more intensely. I guess that's the word to say, but I mean, we have done it before. And in many ways, when you're describing what the Chinese are doing, what the PRC is doing, they're kind of like using what we've done, or the best aspects of what we've applied. So, I mean, we're capable of doing it, but, you kind of have to look at, well, how are we going to get all this talent? Not everyone has the credentials, but they've been looking at the issues, the trends, and they have some experience to apply. And at this point, it seems like it's a all hands on deck type of situation.
Yeah, 100%, Sam. And I think, to your point, back in the Second World War, this is precisely why they stood up the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is now the Central Intelligence Agency. So one thing kind of led into another, but there was a need there. There was a need to understand the complexity around systems, the complexity around infrastructure, and I believe a lot of those things were forgotten over time. And I think we need to get back. We need to get back to our roots and start looking at the way in which these things propagate. Now these things are being exponentially compounded because of technology. Quite frankly, if you think that you're utilizing technology to solve a problem, that's very counterintuitive. You're actually creating more complexity in the equation. So it's also important to look at it from that angle as well.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. It is both bureaucracy and these other challenges, the organizational challenges, the cultural challenges that we have, because it stems from inside and outside the organization. We have a culture that has glorified financial engineering, marketing engineering, human resource engineering, and what I mean by that is position, title, job, all the things that we've been doing culturally, and we've gotten away from the drive, the innovation, and that's affecting our pipeline, where we have the talent coming out and the talent being fostered, because we need a long-term pipeline of that. And then we see it organizationally, where we're structured around that. As I mentioned before, we're structured around the degrees and credentials. That's changing a little bit, but it's still there. But we're also structured around other hierarchical endeavors, such as, whether you call it tenure, whether you call it your time in, whether you call it whatever it is. There's these artificial hierarchical structures where you have people who, I'm not knocking people, but who shouldn't be in management, who shouldn't be in leadership, but are there because they've been there 20 or 30 years. They've earned the time, being in there. And what we need is more of the merit and the talent base to start really pushing for the type of innovation we need. Otherwise, we're already falling behind. By many metrics, as CJ mentioned, I think we are actually behind, but that's not a given, and that's only a point in time reference. We have more than the capability to absolutely excel in a lot of these areas, if we choose to drive it.
So how do you get to that point where you streamline those abilities? Because I think a lot of people, they're either stuck in their silos or they're trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B on these issues, because of a lot of underlying issues, like you brought up, whether it's bureaucracy or talent, just bringing them in, having based on merits. You mentioned earlier there are legislation issues to govern the way AI is utilized. But it also seems like we need to have a stronger policy in terms of talent recruitment and retention. And that's an ongoing issue I keep hearing for a long time. But it's like in the military, for recruitment and finding people who are already in shape and have the things needed, the maybe some education or physical fitness, all that. Those are recurring issues. And I remember there was a TED talk with the general, I think it was for the Army, and he did a talk on the importance of putting together programs to help prepare potential recruits. And that was over a decade ago, but the issues are still there. But at this point, one thing I'm always hearing from people is that the word streamline, and I can't think of a few other words, they're not always well received, or they like to take their time, and it could be years, or if it goes through a lot of red tape. But then you have adversaries or competitors who are streamlining the whole processes. The thing is how does America really get full speed on this in order to start tackling them more effectively?
Well, I think what you have to realize is why there's the pushback and problem or challenge with getting these things moving and rectifying. And the first one that you have to look at is path of least resistance. If you look at when you've got an organization, especially large ones, 10,000, 100,000, however many, by the time you get to that kind of scale, how do you organize and manage and promote and classify and structure and hierarchy those types of organizations? And the reason I mentioned path of least resistance is it may not be the best way to do it. It may have unintended consequences or results, but time in, the degree, credentials, and office politics, many other, factors that go into it, and very structured positions that are created. And I don't want to say completely arbitrarily, that's not the case in all cases, but many times arbitrarily created positions and structures. It's much harder to deal with, especially in large organizations. How do you deal with on talent and merit based? That's a much bigger challenge. So you take the easy path, and that doesn't even include legal liabilities of human resources that you get into. So I think that's one big reason that we have the challenge of tackling this issue.
There's a funny meme that's out there, Sam. And there's these two crowds. One is going to the left, and it says answers, um, simple but wrong, and then there's another path that says complex but right. Well, you've got the whole crowd going to the simple but wrong answers, and then you've got maybe one or two folks going to the complex but right. We as a society like hitting the easy button. We're looking for the easy solution. We're looking to get the path of least resistance, like Michael speaks of, because there's bigger issues here that need to be dealt with, but we're dealing with so much data and so much, like I was alluding to, analysis paralysis earlier. People don't want to think about that. They just want to have the easy button that just says, okay, this is my answer, and they're going to take that at face value and roll with it. Unfortunately, that's not the case in the current state of our world with regard to data and technology and systems, and the pace at which technology is driving us forward. So those are things that are important for consideration. They're also important from the aspect of if I'm not looking 4, 5, 6 steps ahead, I'm potentially setting myself up for failure, because we don't have enough people that have been trained to look at the problem like this. And quite frankly, if we don't have more, Michael and I are two guys, but being able to broadcast this out to a broader audience is absolutely critical. And getting some programs going that looks at the complexities of some of these challenges across the board, I believe, is going to get us off of top dead center moving forward in the future.
Well, and this goes to innovation and this issue about the organizational structure. We've gone from a time, we're in a time-based type of paradigm. I'm there Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. I clock in and clock out, put in my 30 years, I get my retirement. And in the world of innovation and the world that we need, time isn't the factor that we're judging on. We're judging based off of execution and results. But again, that's a much harder thing to quantify and judge. That's why people go for the easy path. But it also goes to a big problem, and this is a big problem in innovation in general, not just with AI, is we've developed a culture that punishes failure and does not reward great innovation and success. If I go as an entrepreneur and I go and I take risks, and many examples of entrepreneurs throughout history and modern history, they've failed and they've gone bankrupt many times before you see them as on the Forbes magazine one of the richest people in the world. And that's part of the necessity of innovation. But in the organization, in our military, in our national labs, in our large companies, if you take a risk, which your probability of failing is high, 70, 80, maybe 90, 95%. I mean, the failure rate is actually really high on innovation. You're going to fail. But what happens is now I take the risk. I have a high probability of destroying my entire career. I'm going to get absolutely vilified and punished for it. And if I hit some massive success, there's no upside.
And I think the important part to highlight here is, if you're going to fail, it's the differentiator here is those who have the ability to brush themselves off and get back up and keep moving forward. So that's considered forward progress across the board. There's a lot of people that aren't willing to take a dive into the deep end with the tiger sharks to say, I'm going to throw it all out on the line and go for it, because yes, I could fail, but the other side of that is I could succeed wildly as well and create something innovative that nobody's ever done before. So for that, there still needs to be that level of innovation or that level of risk for forward progress.
And it's a cultural thing too. I mean, we're taught, whether it's, K through 12 and all the way through the universities, we're taught, read the stuff, sit down, write the paper, take the test, get the grade, and you pass or you fail. That's not the way life works. It usually is, especially in this type of arena, it's an iterative growth development process. You don't fail. As Edison said, I haven't failed. I've discovered 10,000 ways that don't work, till you finally hit that one that does. But we're conditioned. So it's more, like I said, it's cultural. It's a conditioning. We're conditioned that we're not supposed to operate that, which creates a challenge, and it creates an organization on a large scale of people that think that way.
Well, like you said, if you fail and you're taking a risk, you're learning from it, and you figure out, well, what I do wrong here? What can I do better next time here or there? Um, from an educational perspective, that's something that I've been paying a lot of attention the last several years, and I forget who brought it up, but they were discussing how the educational system is really, like you're talking about, textbook answers, multiple choice. And if you have a student answer something, but they do it outside of the parameters, they get ostracized, or they don't get the grade or whatever. But I mean, there's a lot of value when people are putting a lot of the synthesis of ideas, whether you're putting in, I'm looking at whether I'm writing a piece or an analysis or something to get people thinking. I mean, it's, again, it goes in, well, I may not know a thing or two that other folks know about AI, but I look at how I can apply it into some other aspect, in order to make a point or whatever that might be helpful in terms of creating ideas that can help, project, innovations or something. So in terms of rewarding people, in terms of getting a chance, or appreciating the level of risk people take, is that just because we've had a bit of a too much of a status quo type of environment? Because I think things are changing a lot faster than folks realize, and that's something I've been noticing for a lot longer. But it's not everyone gets the memo at the same time. So
Well, people do things, especially in large organizations. Talk about this cultural stuff. To not make waves, not get fired, not take risks, not have something bad come down on their heads. And that's going to impact the AI stuff. I mean, we find ourselves behind in many areas simply because people continue on with what they know, even though that may not be valid anymore, even though that may not be the right answer, to what's going on. And there's two sides to risk, and I always use the analogy of accounting, which many people don't know. But when you're doing accounting, there's always a double journal entry. There's always two sides to it, and so many times we always only look at one side of the entry. If you look at the quote unquote safety that people flock to, or they believe that they're engaging in, there's a high risk, because on the other side of that entry is the risk of not innovating, the risk of not doing anything. And there are real consequences for that. And I think that's what our backs are up against right now, is we're facing that second side of the equation. People are finally starting to wake up to it, that we can't just sit with the status quo, because that's not, that's an extraordinarily high risk area, especially when we have outside actors, outside issues and things. We're not siloed in a bubble. And we really have to face it and move this forward. It's not a question if we can ignore it or not deal with it just because it's hard or because it's uncomfortable.
So with going back to AI, I guess a question is that how do you streamline it with some of these underlying issues? I'm not exactly streamline it. What am I trying to say here? It's kind of like um, in terms of thinking about how to apply it, knowing that there's other players who are taking it to levels that maybe we may not be. In your opinion, do you think that the state of research and innovation, I mean, technically it's still high, but going forward, is it going to be declining or staying somewhat intact? Or like, how is AI going to impact that scene as we try to, um, I guess, adapt to these changes? Because we also have issues like supply chains and developing. I guess the question I'm trying to say is, how do you create a balance in terms of AI tech and the knowledge, but also getting all these different things um, ironed out where they're more balanced in use? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Sam. I think the biggest thing right now is communication. Like we've done, to your earlier point, we've done a outstanding job of stovepiping ourselves. I like to call them cylinders of excellence because we get in these cylinders and we think we know what's going on, and the reality of the situation is we really don't. And I think the bigger problem here is I don't care what industry you're in. We all have the same problems, and the same thing can be said for the domain spaces that we operate in. We all have the same problems. They just exist in different areas of industry, in academia, in distribution supply chains, in the defense industrial base, in the military. All of these in IT, in cyber, in big data, all of these problems are relative and they're all connected. So I think it's important to highlight that fact and recognize that we're really not the only ones that have these problems. Like other people in other industries have these issues too. I don't necessarily know if it's being framed properly and it's being talked about, or talked about enough in a more broader sense. Because we have a lot of folks when they start looking at problems, they look down and in, not up and out, which is the way they should be thinking about the problem. Because if I'm going to look at a problem, I want to be able to look at some of the outliers that are going to cause problems that I can delve down into the simplest terms that are going to help me come to these conclusions looking through a systems lens. So
Yeah.
you got.
No, absolutely well said. I mean, um, it goes back to understanding the root problems. When it comes down to it, the root problems are always the same things. It's data and information, being able to extrapolate and analyze that. It's logistics. It's many of these root problems, and everybody thinks that they're facing a unique problem for their industry or their area, and it really boils down to it's always the same problem. You're looking at it through your lens, but it's the same. It's the same logistics, it's the same data, it's the same analysis problem, same algorithms, same things applied to your particular area. Some of your details and your particular pieces of data are obviously, but the problem's not. And when it comes to how do we face it, I think what I started out here with AI of being a probabilistic type of area is kind of the reality that we're facing with all these challenges with AI. I don't think that there is some way to govern it or legislate it. I don't think that there's some way to protect against proliferation. In a matter of you can't stop it. You can do your best to try and protect it as much as possible. But the truth is it's only going to be effective for a period of time, and you have to face the reality of what's going to happen. And it's going to be the same way with changing organizations. when computers and personal computers and business, entered the realm, it changed things from doing things by hand. It changed the way we could collect information, the way we could analyze information. And AI is really, again, solving that same root problem. New tool, but it's the same root problem. The thing that we're going to face with AI is, like I said, the speed and the scale of which it's going to affect it. And that's going to be the one difference that we're going to face. It's like, okay, if this displaces 100,000 jobs, is that really going to have impact? Yes, but it's going to be at a certain scale. If it affects 10 million jobs, what if it affects, worldwide, 100 million, 500 million? What is the scale of the impact going to be, and what is the rate, the speed of which that's going to impact it? And then you can apply that to any particular area of AI. When it comes to nefarious use, surveillance, actionable intelligence, any of the areas that are the same problem, AI is just another tool of solving that. But what is the rate and scale of which it's going to proliferate in those areas?
Yeah, and to Michael's point, a lot of these problems, they're really not new. They've just existed for a very long time, and the way in which people have tried to tackle some of these problems has not been successful, and they end up dealing with the same problem over and over again and expecting a different result.
Well, is it too few people trying to solve these or take a leadership in terms of managing or improving it? Or, I mean, are there too many people who are just relying on other people to solve it? Or is there just too few people doing it to
That's the way the world has always been. I mean, it may not be the most popular way to say it, but you've always heard of the 80-20 rule and different things. Any type of way you want to say it, but there's a small fraction of people usually driving a big bulk of what happens, and that's not going to change. And it's no different with AI. What is going to be different is what the tool is going to be capable of, and how that advancement and that integration of how it's used. And it's going to be interesting because I'll use an example that just came up recently. Of again, I'm going off of what some other people have said, but I guess Marvel used some AI to generate the artwork for the Secret Invasion streaming series, and it looks very odd. And there's been a lot of flack, for it. And yeah, it's just artwork, but it brings up the point. It's like when you actually have to make large scale consequential decisions off of what AI is answering or generating. What does that mean, and when are we going to reach a point, given all these issues that we've discussed today, when that's going to be realistic?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, these are not trivial problems, Sam. We've been dealing with them for a very long time. Just like any new piece of technology or capability, we need to think about systems and capabilities as we move forward. Instead of shiny things, we've gotten tons of shiny things. But I think those systems and that capability and looking through that systems lens, I believe, is absolutely critical to future success.
Well, and we need robustness in it. I mean, I remember going through my early days, just in time was a really big, thing that they pushed. And I remember even back then thinking how challenging, and it just didn't sit right. And we saw, especially with the events that have occurred in recent years, that have strained supply chains, that just in time is great as long as everything is perfect and everything happens. But we live in the real world, and how do you have not just robustness, because that's what people think of. There's a term called anti-fragile, which is not the same as robustness. Anti-fragile is not a robustness factor. It's a factor of how resilient are you to bad things happening and then breaking because of it. And this is one of those things, as we start to utilize and incorporate AI into our stuff. If we start using it initially as a force multiplier, if we start using it as a tool to give us a perspective in actionable intelligence, realizing that we have to put an asterisk next to it of realizing that we can't always just say this is absolute truth, then I believe we can start moving forward with it from that enterprise level. But there's a big difference when there's consequences to it in large scale than when you're just, writing a little poem or making a nice little picture for yourself as an individual.
Yeah, well, with the way AI and the modeling and everything can be used to impact populations. I mean, one thing we've learned from the Russian-Ukrainian war is how you can use these models or deep fakes or disinformation, and how the uses are amazing. I mean, you could replicate an attack on, on a major city, whether it's like, Paris or New York being attacked by Russian MiGs. Obviously, it's for, show you can do that. And there's actually a YouTube channel that does something like that. Basically Russian versus Ukrainian. But I mean, the person who's familiar with, like, first of all, like they tried to make it more obvious that it was a model, but it looked very realistic. But you had a nuclear power plant, and you had a MiG trying to blow things up, and you had anti-aircraft, and you had a guy trying to hit the aircraft. But I mean, people who are more familiar with it would know that it's a deep fake, but every normal person who isn't familiar with, in terms of from a warfare type of perspective, it could be concerning, or, I mean, that's just like one an example. But the guy who does that channel, he has all these disclaimers saying that these are clearly models. And but there are people in the comments board are going like, oh wow, what's going on?
Well, and there's an actual deeper conversation with that happens. Again, this is nothing new. This has been going on for thousands of years. I mean, not even just in modern times. But what happens now is people are looking just at discerning whether something is true or not. But there's a bigger problem of what happens when you undermine and you lose trust and faith in institutions, in news and information, where you stop believing things even if they are true, because it's just become so saturated and so hard to tell what's true and what's not. And again, not a new thing, not a new problem that's been around for millennia, but now it's going to be taken to a whole new scale. That I think that's really going to be a big challenge, is an undermining of trust, just because there's so many things that you're just not going to know.
Absolutely.
So we've been on for, I think, over an hour and a
Yep.
half. But any last thoughts before we sign off? Or I know we covered some interesting areas, proliferation of AI and possible futures of AI. But if you're an optimist, I mean, we have to look at the the dark sides of things, but what are some of the light or the positive ways of seeing how it may evolve with AI? Because maybe we do get things more figured out and we have more cohesion in terms of how we structure or restructure ourselves to deal with the strategic realities we're dealing with now. I mean, what are some positive ways to look at that?
I think the positive things that we can look at is the way in which technology is propagating. Looking at all of the positives that can come out of this, the insight that can be gained through high performance computing and artificial intelligence. But we have to be we have to be stewards of that technology. If we just let it run wild, then we're going to get ourselves into a bit of trouble. So I think it's important to highlight the fact that we have the ability to progress, but there has to be gateways and there have to be barriers to enable that success. If we just let it go hog wild, then we could be setting ourselves up for the anarchy or the taking over of the machines, a lot like Terminator. So it's important to look at those things, making sure that we have the ability to do good, but we have to understand that there has to be governance, there has to be barriers, there have to be things that enable us to be successful in this domain. Because if we just let it run wild, it's going to take on a life of its own. So
Yeah. And we've tried to paint a realistic perspective of what AI is and what the real um, you know, short and midterm impacts are. Obviously, it's going to develop, and anybody who is predicting how it's going to develop, like anything else, is taking an educated guess. But when we look at it, there's some great things about AI. When we look at medicine, analysis for new drugs, we look at, analyzing x-rays, detecting diseases. We look at engineering, we look at solving problems. Again, all the generative things that AI is really good at. It has some really big potential to have enormous positive impacts on the world. And I think it's just like internet, computers, phones, every other advancement and piece of technology that we've had, where it can be it's a dual use technology. It can be utilized for nefarious purposes, and that's what we have to be careful about. But it's not in and of itself, an evil thing. And I think if we, as CJ mentioned, if we don't drive it, we'll get driven. And that's really, I think, the big thing is we really have to drive this.
So, what exactly is it? Is it like an AI renaissance or just an overall tech renaissance that we're dealing with? Or, I
I'd
mean, in
say
terms
tech.
of our public renaissance of tech? Sorry.
I'd say a tech renaissance, Sam. There's so much that's coming at us, and having people that understand what the implications of that renaissance are, I believe, are critically important. And we're going to need more and more integrators, more translators, more systems folks, more systems thinkers, as the technology progresses, as the foundational understandings are broadened across all of these domain spaces, because all of this ends up coming together and literally creating a very, very interesting story as we move forward.
And here's the challenge that I lay down is to, everybody who's out there in various positions and leadership, or wherever they are, it's not a weakness to say that you don't understand and you don't know. I think we really are, the term Renaissance comes from, enlightenment and awakening. It's important to realize sometimes and acknowledge that maybe you don't know. I mean, I have never pretended to know all the answers. In fact, the more I've learned and the more I've grown through the years, the more I realize that I don't know all the answers. And that is a strength in and of itself, because then you seek knowledge, you seek understanding, you reach out and you engage in that conversation, you engage in learning. And I think that one thing above all else, if we can start advancing that culturally, that step will help guide dealing with all the rest of the problems.
Yeah, and Mike brings up an interesting point. So there was a point in time where everybody thought blockchain was going to be the answer to everybody's problem. Well, blockchain is a ledger of the past. It doesn't necessarily dictate future activity. So it's also important to highlight that if you think technology, a piece of technology is going to be able to solve all your problems, number one, you're either lying to yourself or you're completely misguided, because these technology is only going to compound the problem, but having a foundational understanding of the system's architecture is absolutely critical in forward progress. So those are just some of the takeaways that we want the audience to understand, that these things are not going to get any less complicated or complex. Quite frankly, they're going to get more complicated and more complex as the introduction of other technologies comes into the play, the Internet of Things, the ecosystems of ecosystems, and just being able to understand that all of these things are connected, and looking at the way in which those problems are going to propagate. They're going to propagate even faster because the internet's connecting everything at an exponential rate.
Yeah. And I have to say this too, because driving factors and motivations are an important thing when it comes to what gets developed and why it gets developed. In technology, like in software and in many different systems, the driving factor, and people tend to put this in the terms of greed, and it's not. But if you look at driving factors, it's like, I'll use Microsoft as an example. It's really their charge model. Okay, they developed a piece of software. Now, how do they capitalize or benefit off of that? They charge by user, they charge by license, they charge by, cloud charges by compute usage, all these different things, because at the end of the day, that's a reality of the world. And when it comes to this, we have to understand that there are going to be underlying driving factors for what gets developed and why it gets developed and how it's utilized. And that's not always going to be technical. It's going to align with, okay, if I have a AI photo enhancer app, because I was looking at those the other day, some old photos, be cool to, enhance them and everything. And I looked at tons of them. There's all kinds of AI photo enhancers. Well, there's an old saying, if it's free, you're the product. So I looked for a paid one for that particular reason. Not that it's necessarily a guarantee, but what we're going to see is how AI is utilized on the broad social scale in this type of freemium world where we want everything available, we want it free. They're happy to provide it for free because they're accessing their data, they're mining your data, they're targeting you. All these things are happening, and so we have to realize that that is going to have an impact on the progression of AI.
It all comes at a cost at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it always goes to the people. It's all it in terms of dealing and managing with this stuff. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating, and I know we're going to have some more talks about this going forward. Because there's a lot of areas to look at. But I think you made some really good points. Before we sign off here, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I think we've covered quite a bit, Sam. So
Yeah. I always tend
Well,
to go past the time frame, but I'm okay with
yeah.
that because people like
Yeah.
that.
I mean, there's so much information out there on technical aspects of AI or what AI can do, or look at AI doing this. There really, I think, is a desert, kind of a lack of information like this as far as what the real impacts of AI are going to be, how it's going to affect things socially, organizationally, strategically, in enterprise, in military, in government, consequential decisions, complex systems, all these things that we have to do. Because again, people have just been looking at the buzz of AI, not the
Real world implications.
mhm.
Well, we'll be learning more about that going forward. I really appreciate the two of you, and hopefully at some point we'll do this again sometime because it's been a really great talk, and we'll look forward to getting more future insights on these issues. Just want to thank you both again for being on the podcast, and we will see you next time.
Thanks again, Sam, for letting us to come on again and talk and kind of open up the aperture on some of the real issues that are going on in this domain space, because I don't think enough of it's being talked about, quite frankly. And we need to have some more conversations around these subjects that we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you. Well, that concludes our discussion of the 7th episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast. I'd like to thank Carl C.J. Unis and Michael Maestas for taking the time to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of artificial intelligence and the role it will play in help shaping the future of the world. This was an insightful discussion and a firm reminder that there's always more going on in the world than one might realize. That is one of the key goals of this podcast because, well, that's what we do around here. I'd like to personally thank you all for taking the time to listen and watch this podcast. There will be more to come, so be on the lookout for future episodes and check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us. Also, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and mailing list on our website. So on that note, I bid you all farewell. Until the next time, stay safe, sane, and savvy. Bye.